I'm Priya, and this podcast aims to discuss a range of issues and how they impact South Asian women in particular. Today, I'm joined by Dimple Khatiri, who is a mental health pharmacist with a special interest in women's health. Dimple is sharing with us today her lived experience of PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's a chronic medical condition affecting around 3 to 8% of menstruating individuals. So, hi, Dimple. Thank you for joining me today and I'm willing to share your experiences of this condition. So I know when I got in touch with you, I didn't know much about PMDD. And with South Asian culture anyway, we don't speak much about women's health conditions, especially relating to periods. I think there's been a lot of shame and stigma associated with us, which can leave us in the dark. So it's really important to shine a light on PMDD. So first of all, could you explain what PMDD is for those of us that don't know about it?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's a neuroendocrine condition, and it can happen from the point of menstruation when the menstruation begins. And essentially, it's women experiencing a abnormal sensitivity to normal fluctuations that occur during the menstrual cycle. So primarily in the luteal phase. So just a little basic kind of context. The menstrual cycle has two phases. You have your follicular phase, which is sort of days 1 to 13. You have ovulation around day 14. And then your luteal phase is sort of from days 15 to 28. So PMDD tends to um, affect women in that luteal phase, so the second half of the cycle, and it is just experiencing the sensitivity to normal fluctuations. So it's not an hormonal imbalance, it's the normal fluctuations that happen in terms of what kind of then contributes to a
Okay.
period, and that's
And
what
we hear a lot
the
about
condition is
PMS.
essentially.
How is PMDD different to PMS? Because I've heard the symptoms are actually much more severe.
Yes. So PMS is something that would be, kind of experienced by most women just a few days prior to them menstruating. And the symptoms tend to be sort of mild discomfort. It could just be sort of like mild symptoms relating to bloating, maybe increased appetite, particularly for cravings around carbs and sugars. May experience some slight irritability, but it's nothing so, I guess, impactful that it would then kind of cause any sort of distressing symptoms or kind of functional impairment to women. Whereas PMDD is a lot more severe, and it impacts women in a way that can be really debilitating. So the symptoms are experienced pretty much every single month and can include things like increased anxiety, low mood, increased sort of symptom called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It can also include things like suicidal ideation. And this can happen in people that, are generally fine throughout the month, particularly in their first kind of half of their cycle. There is no pre-existing mental health conditions. But because of the way that the brain reacts to these abnormal fluctuations, these symptoms are amplified and can cause, kind of a lot of functional impairment in women. Sometimes I kind of like to explain that the symptoms of sort of what women experience during perimenopause and menopause is experienced by women with PMDD, but it's every single month. So again, you have the brain fog, kind of the lack of motivation, obviously kind of the moods up and down. And so in terms of someone being diagnosed with PMDD, it has to kind of cause that functional impairment and distress to their day-to-day life, pretty much, basically every
When
single
did you
month.
realize that what you had was something different to what others were experiencing around you?
So I think touching back to what you said about being kind of South Asian and within that kind of community, I dismissed my symptoms for such a long time. So I know that I was starting to experience it sort of around the ages of sort of 16, 17. But for, I think I would say for a good 10 years, so kind of leading up to sort of the age of 25, I had just dismissed it as PMS and just thought this was normal. People just, even though I was experiencing, suicidal thoughts every single month, and feel so much better once my period started, because we never talked about it, I'd never even heard of this. I just thought it was normal. And again, I think even even sort of when I started to think something was wrong, I still went to my GP and presented it as PMS because I just never heard of this term. So I'd say it was only a couple of years ago that I knew, kind of had put a name to what it was. And it was literally like tick, 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 every single symptom I had. And then that's what made me present to my GP that actually this is what I think I've got. And then it kind of just went from there, really.
And how long did it take then for you to get a proper diagnosis? Did they believe you straight away or did you have to be referred? What was that process?
I think I think I guess the positives in terms of me receiving a diagnosis was that it was pretty quick because so in terms of getting a diagnosis, firstly, the advice is that you track your cycle and your symptoms prospectively for around 2 cycles. And you can do that using sort of like a symptom tracker. Even with that, it can still take an average up to 12 years for someone to get diagnosed with PMDD, which is it's shocking. And also because the symptoms really overlap with other conditions. So I think for me, being in the position that I was a pharmacist, mental health pharmacist, and I'd done a lot of research, and actually I'd been tracking my symptoms for such a long time that the diagnosis was pretty straightforward in terms of me receiving it. That was probably the easiest part. I think kind of getting the help and sort of the support around that was definitely the more challenging part because again, I think for GPs, there's not a lot of training that goes into it in terms of kind of like making this condition more known across the medical field as well.
And since having that diagnosis confirmed, how has it changed your life?
It's been massive. I think firstly, when I kind of knew what it was, it almost felt like I was validated in terms of my experiences, what I had been going through, the point, that I wasn't crazy because every single month there was this stigma and shame that I would attach to these symptoms that I was having. So I think one was about it kind of validating me that there was something and this wasn't normal, that not every single female experienced this. But I think the other part was acceptance. I know that when I got the diagnosis, it took me, I would say, a good 6 to 12 months to kind of accept, okay, I have this, the chronicity of this condition, that actually it's not just something that will disappear. It's going to be with me pretty much until kind of post-menopause essentially. And so I think that was a really difficult part because although I knew what was going on, I still struggled to kind of acknowledge that, okay, I needed to also accept this in order to live with it rather than kind of fighting my cycle every single month and kind of fighting against my symptoms. And so then once kind of the acceptance came through and, I just kind of threw myself into research with kind of knowing about it, because again, it's just such an under-recognized condition that I think it's empowered me now to sort of speak up more about it, share my story, try and reduce the stigma within myself, but then hopefully try and help with other women as well. And I think whatever I've learned, and it's still a complete learning curve, but everything that I'm kind of learning and trying to put into practice has really helped me sort of manage my symptoms along the way. Whereas before I felt like I didn't know enough to sort of help myself. And so I was doing all the complete wrong things. But now I've got so much information around it that I feel confident in myself to be able to, advise other women who may be going through this.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. And since you've been more public about what you're going through, have you met more women that have the condition? Is there a community out there?
So yes, I found, well, I kind of made my own community. So essentially what happened was I do weekly therapy as well. And I've been doing that for about 3.5 years. And so it was my therapist who kind of pointed it out about the PMDD, actually, ironically. And so, and it's a male as well. So that was also quite shocking. But essentially, he said to me, like, why don't you consider maybe looking for some peer support groups that might help? And so it's kind of signposted me to this kind of organization called IAPMD. So it's the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. And they have something called Inspire on there, which is just basically like a platform for different conditions. It's not just PMDD, but I came across the PMDD one. And it was basically like a chat room sort of thing where, people just kind of post things and about their experience or asking for advice. And I just felt like actually I wanted something where, it was a bit more accessible and kind of like instant responsive. So almost like, like a WhatsApp group. So I just put something out there, like a message if anyone would be interested in joining a WhatsApp group that's specifically, around peer support for people that are either suspecting they've got PMDD or have got a diagnosis, and just women supporting women really. And so that happened last year, and it ended up being, I think like the final total was around 20 women that I had from like all over the world who had contacted me to kind of be part of this group. And it was incredible. I think the commonalities between us all were very similar in the sense of like feeling kind of gaslighted by medical professionals, feeling quite isolated in terms of our symptoms and not really people get understanding, but also just kind of the day-to-day impact really of it affecting us. And so that was massive for me because again, it meant that I had a space where I could share my experiences without people feeling like I'd be judged on what I was experiencing, but also just having that safe space, with women, just kind of raising like, yeah, like lifting women up. But also I learned so much, because I was part of this group, not as a pharmacist. I was part of it as a patient, really. And so I learned so much from these women in terms of the things that they were doing, what they had tried, what they had, what didn't work. And so it was a really nice, fresh perspective. And it just meant, if I was having a bad day, I knew that I had somewhere where I could kind of reach out, and at least one person would, kind of at least be there. So that was nice.
That's really nice to hear. I think community groups can have such an impact, especially one specific, because I doubt anyone else around you who hasn't got it would be really able to support you or at least identify with what you're going through. So having that group sounds really important. And in terms of people around you, how did they react once you shared with them that you've got this diagnosis?
So I think, like for my husband, for example, I think it kind of made a lot of sense. I think, but it meant for him that he needed to learn more about it as well. Because I suppose it was then kind of like at one point, no, I would say it still is, having to kind of plan around the PMDD, so it does impact our lives in terms of, kind of having that awareness around what I can and can't do around different phases of my cycle, how I may be, kind of how he has to sort of adapt as well during that luteal phase where I may be a bit, extra sensitive. But it certainly made sense with some of the conflicts that we were having, kind of, particularly in that luteal phase. And so but again, it was like a learning curve for us both, having to navigate and learn about this. And we didn't get it right all the time, but I think, as I've been making changes, and I think as he's been kind of educating himself more about it, it's been, it's been really effective in terms of kind of working in sync with each other. uh, I would say my friends were very supportive as well, in just kind of like understanding sort of the difficulties that I was having, but also, it meant that I could be more honest and open about how I was feeling if I wasn't up to something. Whereas before I would just push through constantly and not really acknowledge the impact it was having on me. My family, a bit different, I would say. I think, again, they hadn't heard of the condition. So like my mom, my two sisters, they hadn't gone through this, which, for me, it was quite shocking because I know there's a genetic kind of element to this, or can be. And so I think as much as I try to kind of explain to my mom about what I'm going through, I think there's still that kind of cultural difference in terms of, well, we kind of got on with it, what is this kind of thing? And so I have found that quite difficult to kind of navigate conversations around sort of, how this really does impact me. And obviously having to do it in like our kind of native language as well. My Gujarati is not the best. So having to try and break that down. And I think that's what's kind of raised it to me more, is that actually, if I'm having this difficulty with my family and kind of, you know, trying to kind of get people to understand it, then this must be a cultural thing going on, really. Because I remember even just the stigma around being on your period and not going to religious events and things like that. So yeah, that opened my eyes a lot.
Definitely. I think the whole period stigma is one that we need to break down and have more conversations about. And everyone's experience is so different and so individual. And it's just having that discussion around what it means for each person. So
Yeah.
you mentioned there around your personal life. And what about at work? Have you managed to navigate those spaces or perhaps your managers understanding? Are they aware? Do you feel comfortable sharing with them? Because I know it can be a little bit different at work.
Yes, definitely. So I think for a very long time, I mean, obviously I knew something was up, but I still really just pushed through, didn't say anything. I think my previous job to where I am now, I did mention it to a manager. And that took a lot for me. That was the first time that I'd mentioned it, but I was really struggling, feeling really burnt out. And I was worried about being judged. Because ultimately I'm like a mental health professional and then experiencing these mental health difficulties every single month. And so I really did fear that I would get judged and kind of maybe kind of perceived that I'm not capable or competent at my work, even though I never let it affect me in that way. Like, I still showed up every day. It would just mean that I would be crying in between appointments or, things like that, and feeling so brain foggy, but I still showed up because I was just embarrassed to say anything. But it got to a point where I needed to say something. But I mean, unfortunately, I left that role shortly after that. I didn't feel like I got the support that I wanted, because actually I was asking for some reasonable adjustments, which weren't necessarily being made. But the most current job I've got, it was decided, what, it's something I need to declare right at the start, because actually at that point, like, I was unmedicated. I was going through, kind of just different, I was trying different things in terms of helping myself. And I always know starting a new job makes me feel quite vulnerable, highly sensitive. And then adding the PMDD on top of that, I knew like symptoms would be exacerbated. And so I had a really positive experience. Like, I was able to sit down with my manager, our occupational health team, and just sort of like explain how it affects me on a day-to-day basis during my luteal phase. And things like, it affects my motivation. I can really get everything done and very motivated in the first 2 weeks of my cycle. But then kind of in the luteal phase, my motivation will dip. I won't want to be around people, just kind of be more isolated. Um, the fatigue is intense, like, I will not only experience insomnia, which is terrible because I'm waking up feeling so fatigued, so brain foggy, that it does impact kind of my cognitive function. But then I'm feeling so super tired during the day and I can't sleep, obviously. And so it ends up becoming like a vicious cycle. And so, I don't think I'm quite there with some of the adjustments. I think that's just because of the nature of my role, working for like a psychiatric inpatient ward. But there are reasonable adjustments that have been made for me. So if I do feel like I need to work from home during, some of those days, then I can, and just kind of make sure that there's provisional cover. But what I have sort of noticed is that if I was maybe in a job whereby, just having those extra hour and a half sleep in the morning, as opposed to kind of doing your kind of 9 to 5 job, for example, I think that would improve my productivity a lot more. And it's just kind of like working around your cycle, I think, makes a massive difference. But yeah, I mean, that was the first step for me in terms of like actually telling an employer to kind of reduce that stigma for myself. And then I've been providing teaching sessions and to kind of the other pharmacists in my team, and just sharing my story, because I feel like it's important for people to be aware that actually not only is this affecting colleagues, but you may have a friend, you may have a sister, you may have a cousin who may be going through this. And so it's important for everyone to be aware.
Yeah, definitely. I think sharing that message that it does happen to women and this is how it can show up for different women. It certainly, in my mind, ticked a few boxes of like, oh, maybe this is something I should look into a little bit.
Yeah.
And when you're having those conversations with people, are there any myths out there about PMDD? Are people perhaps trying to tell you things about it that aren't true, considering you've done a lot of research and you've spoken to a lot of people about it?
I think the one term that really does sort of annoy me is like PMDD can be described as PMS on steroids, or I've even had gynecologists kind of keep referring to me during my appointments as PMS. And it doesn't sound very, I guess, it doesn't sound that major in the grand scheme of things, but actually PMDD is a distinctive condition in itself, and it's recognized by, so in kind of mental health, we use DSM-5 and ICD-11, which is basically like a huge diagnostic manual. And it's in there. And it's very clear in terms of the distinctive features between PMDD and PMS. And so when you hear it being minimized to PMS, it does upset me, because I'm like, actually, I have had to fight for this. It's taken years. I mean, a good 20 years, I would say, to really understand what this condition is. And then to have it being minimized as PMS, or, someone describing it as PMS on steroids, I think it kind of invalidates the whole experience in terms of what it actually is. So I guess that's one thing. But the other thing, I suppose, is that I think there is a misconception that this is like related to hormonal imbalance. And it absolutely isn't. There isn't any. And this is why things like blood tests won't show anything up for, if someone is kind of investigating into this, because there is no abnormalities with regards to blood tests. It is simply just the normal fluctuations that are happening. And, for different reasons, women who have PMDD will experience a really increased heightened sensitivity to these fluctuations. And so it's almost like your brain is against you at that point during your cycle. And, kind of what should be normal and what you should be experiencing, you're having this insane intense reaction to it. And so, but yeah, I think those are the two things that have kind of happened with me in that regards, which, I think when you have the information and the knowledge about it, you can quickly kind of shut down those conversations. But I still think there's definitely more awareness that needs to be raised around this. Yeah, kind of and myth busting for sure.
For someone who's listened to your story today, how it's impacted your life, and they're thinking this could be something, they've experienced some of those symptoms, what would you suggest would be their next steps to investigate it further?
So I would definitely say, firstly, don't dismiss or minimize your symptoms. There could be something real here going on. So firstly would be looking at tracking the symptoms for at least 2 cycles, because you want to present that information to your GP in order to, kind of look at a diagnosis. And then I would, hopefully, if it is cyclical and the symptoms are cyclical, and knowing that symptoms improve after menstruation, then yeah, that's telling that this could potentially be PMDD. The next steps I would be looking at is, some people don't want to necessarily go on medication, which is completely fine. There are other ways to try and manage it. And so it's then looking at what lifestyle changes can support you to try and help minimize some of these symptoms. And actually a lot of the lifestyle interventions are quite similar to what we recommend in perimenopause and menopause, that can be applicable. It's things like reducing alcohol, reducing smoking. These are all like inflammatory kind of things that can, essentially cause further inflammation, that can further exacerbate symptoms as well. But, prioritizing sleep, prioritizing whole foods, less ultra processed foods, increasing your exercise, doing more strength training. So I think these kind of common lifestyle intervention that we do give to people, they do play a role in this. And it's not to minimize it, because actually they can have a massive impact. But also, I think the other thing is knowing that, you're not alone in this, as isolating as this condition feels. And it really does. But, you know, educating your friends and family about it. I mean, there's a really great book which has been written by a partner of someone who's got PMDD, and it's called Hope. And I actually bought that for my husband. And I read it myself as well. And it's great, because it's kind of written in a humorous way, but it also does take the condition very seriously. And it's just, I think it's important to educate and increase that awareness around your social network, because then people are aware of what's going on with you. And then you don't feel like you've got to put up this facade that every single month you've got to push through this. Like it's okay to rest. It's okay to prioritize things around your cycle. And, it's okay that you're not going to be functioning the best in your second half of your cycle, but it's also kind of making other people aware of that. So you're not carrying that guilt, and feeling that pressure to kind of be the perfectionist that you may be in that first half of your cycle. I think is those are really key lessons I've learned for sure.
Thank you for sharing that, Dimple, and for sharing your experiences in your story. And I'm sure people listening to this podcast will have some hope about reaching out to people, doing the tracking, talking about it more, and just seeing, you know, making those connections, I suppose, if it is something that is going on with them. Like we said, people don't talk about it enough. So hopefully, if we spark some conversations and some more awareness about it, that would be fantastic. So thank you so much for coming today and sharing your story.
Thank you for having me. And yes, 100% agree. I think we specifically within kind of these kind of cultures, we do need to improve awareness because there's just not enough research about how it impacts us. And, if you look back at kind of causes and who may be predisposed, if we look at kind of trauma, if we go back to kind of intergenerational, kind of factors that we may, or our family may kind of experience as well, that there's so many things that could impact somebody and they don't realize, and we just get on with it. So thank you for having me.